There are moments in life when we must choose between walking away or risking everything for a stranger. Sometimes the greatest courage comes not from youth and strength, but from a heart that has already known loss and still chooses kindness. Elira was 53 when she made the choice that would change her forever. In the dying village of Grimhaven, where famine had turned neighbors into enemies, she watched the church drag a pale stranger to the auction block. The crowd called him a demon, bound in iron chains and condemned to die. But Elira saw something else, a man who needed saving. With her last silver coins, the final remnants of her late husband's inheritance, she bought his freedom. The villagers laughed at the foolish widow who purchased a monster. What they didn't know was that this stranger was no ordinary man, but an ancient vampire whose gratitude would awaken feelings she thought were buried with her youth. What happens when an act of mercy unleashes a love that defies both time and death? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the cracked shutters of Elira's cottage, casting familiar shadows across the worn wooden table where she sorted her herbs. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, separating chamomile from feverfew, each dried bloom a testament to knowledge passed down through generations of healers. The leather-bound grimoire lay open beside her work, its yellowed pages filled with remedies written in her grandmother's careful script, then her mother's flowing hand, and now her own precise notations in the margins. Outside, the village of Grimhaven stirred reluctantly to life. The sound of cartwheels on cobblestones spoke of another day's struggle against the famine that had gripped their land for 3 harsh winters. Through her window, Elira could see Widow Thornton drawing water from the well, her movements slow and deliberate, conserving strength that came harder with each passing season. The baker's shop remained shuttered. Grain had become too precious for daily bread, reserved now for the wealthy merchants and church officials who still possessed silver to trade. Elira rose from her chair, her joints protesting the morning chill that seemed to settle deeper into her bones each year. At 53, she had outlived her husband by 7 years, outlived 2 of her 3 children by plague, and outlived the hope that Grimhaven would return to the prosperous market town of her youth. Yet her hands remained steady, her mind sharp, and her heart, though weathered by loss, still capable of tenderness. She moved to her kitchen, where bundles of dried lavender hung from the rafters, their fragrance a reminder of summers, when the fields bloomed purple and the air carried the sound of children's laughter, instead of the constant toll of funeral bells. Her cottage had been her sanctuary since Thomas's death, a place where grief could settle into acceptance and loneliness could transform into solitude. The rooms held memories like pressed flowers between the pages of a book precious, fragile, but somehow enduring. The knock on her door came softly, as they always did. In Grimhaven, desperation had taught people humility. She opened it to find young Marcus, the blacksmith's apprentice, cradling his left hand against his chest. A burn, fresh and angry, marked his palm where molten iron had kissed his skin. "Mistress Elira," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Master Willem sent me, said you'd have something for the burn." She guided him to her table, noting how thin he'd grown since last winter. The boy was barely 16, but hardship had carved premature lines around his eyes. As she cleaned the wound with blessed water and applied a poultice of comfrey and honey, she found herself thinking of her son. David, who would have been Marcus's age, had fever not claimed him. "The pain will ease by evening," she assured him, wrapping his hand with clean linen. "Change the dressing tomorrow, and come see me if the wound shows signs of corruption." Marcus nodded, offering her a small copper coin payment that represented perhaps his entire week's earnings. She accepted it with grace, knowing that dignity mattered more than charity, especially to a young man already struggling to prove his worth in an unforgiving world. After he left, Elira returned to her herbs, but her concentration had fractured. Lately, she found herself dwelling on the past more often, perhaps because the present offered so little comfort. She remembered the early years of her marriage, when Thomas would return from his carpentry work with sawdust in his hair and stories of the houses he was helping to build. They had dreamed of prosperity then, of children who would inherit a better world than the one they'd known. The irony was not lost on her that she had become, in many ways, what her grandmother had been, the wise woman at the edge of the village, consulted in times of need but otherwise left to her solitude. The grimoire that sat before her contained not just remedies for the body, but wisdom about the human heart, about loss and healing, and the quiet strength that emerges from surviving what seems unsurvivable. She turned to a page her grandmother had marked with a pressed violet, reading the familiar words, "The greatest healers are those who have known their own brokenness." Below it, in her mother's hand, "Compassion is born from understanding that all souls carry wounds." And in her own writing, added just last winter, "Sometimes mercy is the only magic we possess." The afternoon brought more visitors, a merchant's wife seeking a remedy for her husband's persistent cough, an elderly farmer requesting a salve for his arthritic joints, a young mother desperate for something to ease of her infant's colic. Each interaction reminded Elira of her place in the village's intricate web of need and offering. She was trusted, respected, perhaps even loved in the careful way that people love those who serve them faithfully. Yet as evening approached and the last of her visitors departed, the familiar weight of loneliness settled around her shoulders like a worn shawl. She prepared her simple supper bread, cheese, and the last of her preserved apples, and ate by candlelight while reading from her grimoire. The silence of her cottage was broken only by the occasional settling of timbers and the distant sound of the church bell marking the hours. She thought often of Thomas in these quiet moments, remembering how he used to tease her about her witchy ways with herbs and healing. He had never understood her gift, but he had respected it, even taken pride in it when neighbors sought her help. "My clever wife," he would say, watching her prepare a tincture or bind a wound, always knowing just what someone needs. The memory brought both comfort and sorrow. Thomas had died suddenly, his heart simply stopping one morning as he worked in their garden. She had found him peaceful among the rosemary bushes, his face serene, his calloused hands still holding the pruning shears. All her knowledge of healing had been powerless against that final enemy, and the realization had taught her both humility and the limits of mortal strength. In the months that followed his death, she had considered leaving Grimhaven, perhaps traveling to her sister's village 2 days north, where the famine had not struck so severely. But something had anchored her here, duty, perhaps, or simply the understanding that running from grief rarely led to healing. She had stayed, tending to others as she slowly tended to herself, learning that service to others could be its own form of medicine. The grimoire lay open to a page about protective charms, methods for warding off evil influences. Her grandmother had been more superstitious than practical, filling the margins with warnings about supernatural threats and instructions for recognizing signs of otherworldly danger. Elira had always treated such passages with gentle skepticism, focusing instead on the practical remedies that she could see work with her own eyes. Tonight, however, as she prepared for sleep, those ancient warnings seemed less foolish than they once had. The village had grown strange in recent months, plagued by rumors of unnatural occurrences, livestock found drained of blood, crops withering overnight despite adequate rain, travelers who disappeared on well-traveled roads. The church had responded with increased vigilance, sending inquisitors to investigate reports of supernatural activity and offering rewards for information about possible witchcraft or demonic influence. Elira had paid little attention to such talk, attributing the strange events to the natural desperation that accompanies prolonged hardship. Hungry people saw omens everywhere, and frightened communities often sought supernatural explanations for misfortunes that had perfectly ordinary causes. Yet she could not deny that something in the air had changed, a tension that made even the most rational villagers glance over their shoulders when walking alone after dark. As she banked her fire and prepared for sleep, Elira offered a quiet prayer of gratitude for another day, safely passed, another collection of small acts of healing completed. Tomorrow would bring new needs, new opportunities to serve, new chances to transform suffering into something bearable. It was a modest life, perhaps, but one that felt aligned with the deepest truths her grandmother's grimoire had taught her about the purpose of human existence. She touched the silver wedding ring that still circled her finger, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. Thomas had placed it there 31 years ago, promising to love her through whatever joys and sorrows life might bring. He had kept that promise until his last breath, and she continued to honor it in the way she lived, with kindness, with purpose, and with the quiet courage that comes from having loved deeply and lost gracefully. Outside her window, the village settled into the uneasy sleep that had become common in these troubled times. Guards walked their rounds, doors were barred against both human and supernatural threats, and mothers whispered protective prayers over their children's beds. In her cottage at the edge of the settlement, Elira drifted towards sleep, surrounded by the scents of healing herbs and the comfort of knowledge accumulated across generations. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring a choice that would transform not only her own carefully ordered existence, but the very nature of what it meant to choose compassion over safety. The grimoire rested beside her bed, its ancient wisdom waiting to guide her through trials she could not yet imagine, but which her grandmother's warnings had perhaps always known were coming. The morning air carried an unusual chill as Elira made her way to the village square, her basket filled with remedies for the weekly market. The sound of excited voices and the clatter of wheels on cobblestones suggested something beyond the ordinary bustle of market day. As she rounded the corner past the baker's shuttered shop, she saw the cause of the commotion, a procession of church guards surrounding a wooden cart, their polished armor gleaming despite the overcast sky. Father Aldrich stood on the church steps, his voice carrying across the square as he addressed the growing crowd. "Citizens of Grimhaven," he proclaimed, his tone heavy with righteous authority, "today we witness God's justice made manifest. The demon that has plagued our neighboring villages has been captured, bound by blessed iron, and brought here for all to see the power of divine retribution." Elira pressed closer, her healer's instincts drawn to any soul in distress. The crowd parted reluctantly before her, many villagers knowing her face and respecting her place among them. When she finally glimpsed the cart's contents, her breath caught in her throat. Chained within iron shackles that seemed to burn against his pale skin lay a man unlike any she had ever seen. His hair was the color of winter moonlight, falling across a face that appeared carved from marble, beautiful in the way that ancient statues were beautiful, perfect and remote and somehow timeless. Yet it was his eyes that held her attention, silver grey and filled with a weariness that spoke of suffering beyond mortal comprehension. Despite his chains and the jeers of the crowd, he maintained a dignity that made the villagers' mockery seem crude and small. "Behold," Father Aldrich continued, "the creature that has drained livestock and corrupted the innocent. See how the blessed iron burns his unholy flesh, proof of his demonic nature." The man's wrists were indeed marked where the shackles touched his skin, but he made no sound of pain, no plea for mercy. He simply endured, as though suffering was as familiar to him as breathing. An elderly merchant stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square. "What do you propose to do with this thing, Father?" "The church has decreed that such creatures shall be sold at public auction," Aldrich replied. "The proceeds will fund our continued efforts to cleanse this land of supernatural corruption. Who among you has the courage to bid on this demon? Perhaps he can be put to use in the mines or the quarries where honest folk fear to venture." Elira felt sick at the casual way they discussed another being's fate. She had seen enough death in her years of healing to recognize the difference between evil and suffering. This pale stranger radiated neither malice nor corruption, only an profound exhaustion that reminded her of her own grief in the months following Thomas's death. The bidding began with crude jokes and nervous laughter. A farmer offered a handful of coppers for the novelty of owning a demon. A merchant suggested the creature might make good sport for his hunting dogs. Each callous remark deepened Elira's growing horror at her neighbor's cruelty. These were people she had healed, comforted, and served for decades. Yet faced with something they didn't understand, they responded with vicious mockery. The bound man's eyes moved across the crowd, and for a moment, his gaze met hers. In that instant, she saw something that made her decision inevitable. Not the dangerous supernatural being the church claimed he was, but a soul in profound pain, abandoned and condemned by those who should have shown mercy. She thought of her grandmother's words written in the grimoire. "Sometimes mercy is the only magic we possess." 10 silver pieces, she called out, her voice cutting through the cruel laughter. The square fell silent. 10 silver represented nearly everything she owned, the last remnants of Thomas's inheritance that she had saved for true emergencies. Heads turned toward her in shock and disapproval. She was the respected healer, the wise woman who tended their wounds and eased their pain. What madness possessed her to bid on a demon? "Mistress Elira," Father Aldrich said, his tone patronizing yet tinged with concern, "surely you cannot mean to purchase this creature. Think of your reputation, your standing in the community." "I mean exactly what I said," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. 10 silver pieces. A merchant from the next village laughed harshly. "The witch woman wants a demon for her collection of dark arts," he sneered. "Perhaps they're kindred spirits." The insult stung, but Elira had endured worse whispers over the years. Her healing abilities had always walked the fine line between respected skill and suspected witchcraft. She kept her eyes fixed on the pale stranger, whose expression had shifted from resignation to something approaching wonder. 15 silver, called out a voice from the back, a slave trader from the coastal towns who dealt in human misery. "I can find work for such a creature in the salt mines." Elira's heart sank. 15 silver was beyond her means, but the thought of this being sold to a life of brutal labor was unbearable. She opened her mouth to speak, though she had nothing more to offer, when the bound man himself broke his silence for the first time. "The woman who shows mercy deserves consideration," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. It was cultured, refined, with an accent that spoke of distant lands and ancient bloodlines. "I would serve her more faithfully than any who bids from cruelty or profit." Father Aldrich's face darkened. The demon speaks to influence the bidding. This proves his corrupting nature. But something in the stranger's words had touched the crowd's sense of fairness, or perhaps their respect for Elira's years of service. The slave trader looked uncertain, glancing around at hostile faces. No one else seemed inclined to bid against the village's beloved healer for the sake of supporting an outsider's cruel purposes. 10 silver to Mistress Elira, the auctioneer declared after an uncomfortable pause. "Unless there are other bids?" Silence stretched across the square. The slave trader spat in disgust and pushed through the crowd toward his wagon. Father Aldrich's expression suggested he was storing this moment away for future consideration. Elira stepped forward on unsteady legs, counting out her precious coins with hands that shook despite her determination. As the silver changed hands, she found herself the owner of a chained stranger who might indeed be the demon the church claimed he was. The iron shackles were transferred to her custody, along with stern warnings about the creature's dangerous nature and explicit instructions that she would be held responsible for any harm he might cause. The crowd dispersed slowly, many villagers casting backward glances of concern, disapproval, or simple curiosity. Old friends avoided her eyes, while others offered nervous smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She had irrevocably changed her standing in the community, marking herself as either foolishly compassionate or dangerously reckless. "Can you walk?" she asked the pale man quietly as the guards prepared to remove his chains. "With effort," he replied, his silver eyes studying her face as though trying to understand the mystery of her mercy. "You have purchased a great deal of trouble, gentle healer. How do you know what I am?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Your hands bear the stains of healing herbs, and your eyes hold the wisdom that comes from easing others' pain. Also, every person in this crowd has looked upon me with fear or greed. Only you have looked with compassion." The iron shackles fell away, with a sound like breaking bells, leaving angry red marks around his wrists and ankles. He stood slowly, his pale skin gleaming like starlight in the overcast morning, and she realized he was taller than she had expected, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of hidden strength despite his obvious weakness. "I am called Van," he said, offering her a bow that belonged to royal courts rather than village squares. "And I am more grateful for your kindness than words can express." "I am Elira," she replied, then gestured toward the path leading to her cottage. "Come, those wounds need tending, and you need food and rest." As they walked together through the village streets, she was acutely aware of the whispered conversations and concerned glances that followed their progress. She had acted from pure compassion, unable to bear witnessing another soul's suffering when she possessed the means to intervene. Yet, as they approached her cottage, she wondered if her grandmother's warnings about supernatural dangers had been wiser than she'd ever imagined. The silver wedding ring on her finger seemed heavier with each step, as though Thomas himself were questioning the wisdom of her choice. Behind them, the church bell began to toll, and she could not shake the feeling that it was ringing a farewell to the simple, safe life she had known. The cottage felt different, with another presence inside its familiar walls. Elira busied herself preparing a basin of warm water and gathering supplies to tend Van's wounds, while he sat quietly at her kitchen table, his silver eyes taking in the bundles of dried herbs, the worn grimoire, and the simple comforts of a life lived in service to others. "You have a healer's sanctuary," he observed, his cultured voice carrying notes of appreciation. "I can feel the peace that dwells in these walls." Elira paused in her preparations, surprised by his perception. Most visitors noticed only the herb bundles or perhaps commented on the cottage's modest comfort. None had ever spoken of feeling peace within these rooms, though she had always sensed it herself, a quality built from years of quiet contentment and purposeful work. "My grandmother taught me that healing requires more than knowledge," she replied, approaching with the basin and clean cloths. The space itself must welcome recovery. She knelt beside his chair to examine the angry red marks around his wrists, where the iron had burned his skin. The wounds were unlike anything she had encountered, not quite burns, yet deeper than simple abrasions, as though the metal had reacted with something fundamental in his nature. As she gently cleaned the damaged skin, she noticed how cold his flesh felt beneath her fingers, and how still he sat, as though breathing were optional rather than necessary. "These chains were crafted specifically to harm your kind," she said, applying a cooling salve of comfrey and aloe. "What? The manner of being requires such specialized restraints." Van was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I am what your church calls a creature of darkness. What legends name a vampire? What I call myself is simply a soul who has lived too long and seen too much suffering." The words settled into the cottage's peaceful silence, like stones dropping into still water. Elira continued her work without pause, wrapping his wrists in clean linen while processing what he had revealed. A vampire, the creature from children's tales and monastery warnings, sitting in her kitchen and submitting to her care with the patience of a wounded animal who has learned to trust human kindness. "Are you afraid?" he asked, studying her face with those unsettling silver eyes. She considered the question honestly. "I should be," she admitted. "Every story I've heard suggests I should be terrified. Yet when I look at you, I see exhaustion more than danger, pain more than malice." Around her neck, her grandmother's moonstone pendant began to emit a soft, warm glow, so subtle she almost missed it. The small blue stone had been a family treasure for generations, worn by the women in her line who served as healers. She had always assumed its occasional luminescence was merely candlelight, reflecting off its surface, but now it pulsed with inner light that seemed to respond to Varn's presence. He noticed it immediately. "Your pendant recognizes what I am," he said with something approaching wonder. Such stones were once used to identify supernatural beings, though few remain who remember their purpose. "My grandmother left many mysteries unsolved," Elira replied, touching the warm stone with her fingertips. Perhaps she knew more about the world's hidden nature than she ever shared. She finished tending his wounds and moved to prepare food, though she suspected he might not require ordinary sustenance. Simple act of hospitality felt important, a way of affirming his humanity despite his supernatural nature. She sliced bread and cheese, gathered apples from her dwindling stores, and set them before him with the same care she would offer any guest. "You waste good food on one who cannot properly appreciate it," Varn said, though his tone carried gratitude rather than complaint. "Perhaps," she agreed, settling into the chair across from him, "but sharing a meal is about more than nourishment. It's about acknowledging another's worth, offering comfort, creating connection between souls who might otherwise remain strangers." He reached for a piece of bread, eating slowly, as though the act were foreign but not unpleasant. "It has been decades since anyone offered me such simple courtesy. I had forgotten how healing ordinary kindness can be." As the afternoon progressed, Elira found herself drawn into conversation with this strange guest. He spoke of distant lands he had visited, of changes he had witnessed across the centuries, of the loneliness that came from outliving everyone he had ever cared for. His words painted pictures of a world far larger and more complex than her village experience had prepared her to imagine. "How old are you?" she asked during a comfortable lull in their conversation. "Old enough to remember when this village was nothing but forest and deer paths," he replied. "Old enough to have forgotten what it feels like to belong somewhere, to be welcomed rather than feared." The sadness in his voice resonated with her own experiences of isolation. Since Thomas's death, she had felt increasingly separate from the normal rhythms of village life, respected but set apart, needed but not quite belonging. Perhaps that was why his presence felt less frightening than it should have. They were both outsiders in their own ways, both acquainted with the particular loneliness that comes from being different. As evening approached, the practical question of sleeping arrangements could no longer be avoided. She prepared Thomas's old chair by the fireplace, bringing blankets and pillows to make it as comfortable as possible. "You honor me with trust I'm not certain I deserve," Varn said as she arranged the bedding. "My grandmother always said that how we treat those who are powerless reveals who we truly are," Elira replied. "You're wounded, alone, and dependent on my mercy. What manner of person would I be if I failed to offer shelter and safety? A wise one, perhaps. I'm not powerless, Elira. Even weakened, I possess abilities that could harm you before you could cry for help." She met his gaze directly. "Yet you won't. I see that truth in your eyes, just as clearly as I see your weariness and your longing for peace." He smiled. Then the first genuine expression of happiness she had witnessed from him. "You see far too much for your own good, but you see truly." Outside, night was falling over Grimhaven, bringing with it the usual sounds of a village settling into cautious sleep. Elira banked the fire and prepared for bed, acutely aware of her guest's presence in the next room. The moonstone pendant continued its gentle glow, warm against her skin, as though approving of her choice to offer sanctuary to this unlikely stranger. Before retiring, she paused by the grimoire that still lay open on her table. Tonight, the ancient warnings about supernatural creatures seemed less like superstition and more like incomplete wisdom. Her grandmother had written about protecting against dark forces, but perhaps she had never considered what to do when darkness came seeking healing rather than harm. As she drifted towards sleep, Elira reflected on the day's extraordinary events. She had purchased a vampire's freedom, brought him into her home, and discovered that her family's pendant possessed magical properties she had never suspected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the village's questions, Father Aldrich's disapproval, and the practical considerations of harboring a being whose very existence challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. Yet despite the uncertainties ahead, she felt a sense of rightness about her choice that reminded her of her wedding day, the same mixture of nervousness and certainty that came with stepping into an unknown future, guided only by the heart's deepest convictions. Dawn came gently to Elira's cottage, filtering through windows that no longer seemed to contain just her solitary world. She woke to find Varn standing motionless by the eastern window, his pale figure outlined against the growing light like a sculpture carved from moonbeams. He had not moved from that position all night. She realized vampires, it seemed, had little need for sleep. "The sunrise is beautiful from here," he said without turning, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "I had forgotten how peaceful morning can be when witnessed from sanctuary rather than be shadow." She joined him at the window, noting how the early light seemed to catch and reflect in his silver hair without causing him discomfort. Another myth dispelled sunlight did not burn him, though it revealed the otherworldly pallor of his skin with startling clarity. "You've been watching all night?" she asked. "Guarding," he corrected gently. "Old habits born from centuries of protecting what I valued. Though I admit, standing vigil over safety rather than against threat is a novel experience." Outside in her herb garden, something extraordinary had occurred during the night. Where yesterday only the hardy winter plants had survived, a single rose bush now bloomed in defiance of the season. The flowers were deep crimson, their petals seeming to hold traces of captured starlight, and they filled the morning air with a fragrance more intoxicating than any earthly bloom. "How is this possible?" Elira breathed, staring at the impossible flowers. Varn's expression grew, thoughtful. "My kind sometimes affects the natural world in unexpected ways. Where we find peace, where we are welcomed rather than feared, life responds. The roses bloom because your garden has become a place of sanctuary." She reached for her shawl and stepped outside, drawn by the miraculous sight. The roses were real. She could touch their velvet petals, smell their otherworldly fragrance, feel the thorns that protected their beauty. Yet they pulsed with an energy that spoke of magic woven into nature itself. "They're magnificent," she whispered, then looked back at Varn with new understanding. "You did this?" "Not consciously, but yes. My presence here, combined with your acceptance, has awakened possibilities that lay dormant in your garden's soil." He moved closer, his voice dropping to something approaching reverence. "In 5 centuries of existence, I have brought mostly death and fear wherever I dwelt. To create beauty instead, it is a gift I never expected to receive." The sound of approaching footsteps on the cottage path interrupted their wonder. Marcus, the blacksmith's apprentice, appeared around the corner, his bandaged hand held carefully at his side. He stopped short when he saw Varn, his young face cycling through confusion, recognition, and dawning fear. "Mistress Elira," he said, his voice tight with concern. Is that the creature from yesterday's auction?" "This is Varn," she replied calmly, stepping slightly between the boy and her guest. "He's recovering from his ordeal." Marcus's eyes fixed on the impossible roses, then back to Varn's pale features. "The whole village is talking about what you did. Father Aldrich says you've brought a demon into our midst. Says the church may need to intervene for everyone's safety." Elira felt her stomach clench with worry, but Varn spoke before she could respond. "The boy is frightened, as he should be. I mean no harm to you or your village, young one, but I understand why my presence alarms you. It talks, Marcus whispered, as though this somehow made the situation more rather than less threatening. He speaks, Elira corrected firmly, as do we all when we're treated with courtesy rather than suspicion. The apprentice shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between his trust in the village healer and his fear of the supernatural being standing before him. My hand is healing well, he said finally, lifting his bandaged palm. The pain is nearly gone, just as you promised. I'm glad to hear it. Remember to change the dressing daily until the skin fully mends. Marcus nodded, backing away toward the path. Mistress Elira, please be careful. Whatever that thing is, the village won't tolerate its presence for long. People are scared. After the boy left, Elira sank onto her garden bench, the weight of her situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She had acted from compassion, but the consequences were beginning to unfold in ways she hadn't fully considered. The village that had respected and relied on her for decades now viewed her with suspicion and fear. I have brought trouble to your peaceful life, Vaughn said, settling beside her on the bench. Perhaps I should leave before the situation worsens. Where would you go? She asked. Back to wandering alone, hiding in shadows, surviving on the edges of a world that fears you? It is what I know, what I have always known. She turned to study his profile, noting the resignation that sat like armor around his shoulders. My grandmother wrote that loneliness is the cruelest prison because we carry it with us wherever we flee. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the impossible roses sway in the morning breeze. Elira found herself thinking about the choices that had brought them both to this moment. Her decision to bid at the auction, his willingness to trust her mercy, the slow awakening of something deeper than gratitude or duty between them. Tell me about your life before, she said eventually, before you became what you are now. Vaughn was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the distant quality of memory reaching across centuries. I was born to nobility in a kingdom that no longer exists, trained in warfare, diplomacy, the arts of leadership. I commanded armies, negotiated treaties, believed myself destined for greatness. What changed you? Betrayal. My younger brother, consumed by ambition, made a pact with dark powers to claim my throne. The curse that transformed me was meant to be my death instead. It became my prison. I watched my kingdom fall, my people suffer, everyone I loved grow old and die while I remained unchanged, unable to prevent any of it. The pain in his voice resonated with her own experiences of loss, though on a scale she could barely comprehend. That's why you were captured, because you tried to help people? I heard rumors of supernatural threats plaguing villages near where I had taken shelter. Old habits die hard. I investigated, discovered a nest of true monsters preying on innocents, and eliminated them. Unfortunately, the church authorities arrived just as I was burning their lair. Guilt by association, and my nature made conviction inevitable. Elira reached out instinctively, covering his cold hand with her warm one. The gesture surprised them both. She had never been one for casual touch, even during her marriage, but something about his suffering called to the healer in her, demanding comfort beyond words. You were punished for protecting people, she said softly. Justice rarely concerns itself with intent when fear drives judgment. The church bell began to toll in the distance, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Elira wondered if Father Aldrich would use the service to denounce her choice, to rally the village against the supernatural threat now dwelling in their midst. The sound that had once comforted her now carried ominous implications for the fragile peace she and Vaughn had discovered in her cottage sanctuary. Yet as she sat beside him in her impossible garden, watching crimson roses bloom where none should grow, she found her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly needed, not just for her healing skills, but for her capacity to see beyond surface appearances to the wounded soul beneath. The afternoon brought visitors. Elira had not expected 3 village women who had been among her most faithful patients over the years. They arrived together, their faces bearing the uncomfortable expressions of people forced into an unpleasant duty by community pressure. "Mistress Elira," said Agnes Whitmore, the baker's widow, wringing her hands nervously. "We've come as friends, hoping to speak sense to you before this situation grows beyond remedy." Varn had withdrawn to the cottage's back room at the sea. First sound of approaching voices, understanding instinctively that his presence would only inflame tensions. Elira invited the women inside, noting how they glanced nervously at the impossible roses visible through her window, their supernatural beauty serving as evidence of the otherworldly influence now residing in her home. "Speak plainly," Elira said, settling them at her kitchen table with cups of chamomile tea. "What brings you here with such troubled faces?" Martha Thornton, the blacksmith's wife, leaned forward earnestly. "The entire village is speaking of nothing but your purchase yesterday. People are frightened, Elira. Children refuse to play near this end of the village, and their mothers support their caution. Father Aldrich held a special gathering this morning," added young Beatrice Cooper, barely past her 20th year, but already bearing the worried expression of a mother protecting her infant son. He spoke of corruption spreading through our community, of how supernatural influences can poison even the purest hearts if given opportunity. Agnes nodded solemnly. "He didn't mention you by name, but everyone understood his meaning. The church is deeply concerned about the creature you've harbored, and they question whether its presence might be affecting your judgment." Elira sipped her tea calmly, though anger simmered beneath her composed exterior. These women had sought her help countless times, Agnes, for the painful joints that came with age, Martha for the difficult birth of her youngest son, Beatrice for the fever that nearly claimed her baby last winter. Now they sat in her kitchen, questioning her wisdom and loyalty based on fear and gossip. "Has any harm come to anyone since Varn arrived in my care?" she asked quietly. The women exchanged uncertain glances. "Well, no," Martha admitted. "But the roses, everyone can see them from the road. Nothing natural could bloom so perfectly in this season. It's clear evidence of unnatural influence." "Perhaps," Elira agreed. "But do those roses threaten anyone? Do they spread poison or decay? Or do they simply offer beauty in a world that has seen too little of it recently?" Beatrice shifted uncomfortably. "Beauty created by demonic power is still corruption, no matter how pleasing it appears. Father Aldrich says that's how evil works, by making sin attractive, by tempting good people to compromise their principles." "And what principles am I compromising?" Elira's voice carried the authority she had developed through decades of healing work. "The principle of showing mercy to those who suffer, the principle of offering shelter to those who need sanctuary, the principle of judging people by their actions rather than their nature." Agnes reached across the table, touching Elira's hand with genuine concern. "You've always been good to us, dear. No one questions your heart or your healing gifts. But this creature, this vampire, he's not like us. He doesn't belong in our world, and his presence puts everyone at risk." "Does it?" Elira withdrew her hand gently. "Or does our fear of what we don't understand put us at risk of becoming people we wouldn't recognize in ourselves?" From the back room came the soft sound of movement, and Varn appeared in the doorway, his pale figure seeming to gather shadows around himself, despite the afternoon light. The 3 women drew back instinctively, their breathing quickening with involuntary terror. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his cultured voice carrying perfect courtesy despite their obvious fear. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns, and they deserve acknowledgement." "Varn, you don't need to," Elira began, but he raised his hand gently. "Yes, I do." He moved closer but maintained careful distance from the frightened women. "You speak of protecting your children, your community, your way of life. These are noble impulses, worthy of respect. I understand why my presence alarms you. Martha found her voice, though it trembled slightly. Then why do you remain? Why not leave Grimhaven in peace? Because I have found something here I never expected to discover: acceptance without conditions, mercy without judgment, the possibility of belonging somewhere after centuries of exile. His silver eyes found Elira's across the room. But more than that, I have found someone worth protecting, even if that protection means facing the fear and hatred of those who cannot see beyond my nature. Beatrice hugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders. You speak of protection, but what could threaten Mistress Elira that requires supernatural intervention? Vaughn's expression grew grave. The same forces that condemned me to this existence still move through your world. The Church's inquisitors carry blessed weapons designed to destroy my kind, but they also hunt anyone suspected of supernatural sympathy. Your healer's compassion toward me has marked her as a potential threat in their eyes. The women looked shocked. None had considered that Elira herself might be in danger because of her choice to show mercy. That's impossible, Agnes protested. Elira is beloved in this village. She's helped birth half our children, healed our sick, eased our dying. No one would believe accusations against her. Wouldn't they? Vaughn's voice carried the weight of experience. Fear makes people capable of betraying their deepest convictions. How many of your neighbors would stand against church authority to defend a woman who harbors demons? How many would choose loyalty over safety when pressed to choose? The cottage fell silent except for the ticking of Elira's mantle clock and the distant sound of the wind stirring the impossible roses in her garden. The women sat frozen between conflicting impulses, their trust in Elira and their fear of the supernatural being who spoke such uncomfortable truths. We came here hoping to convince you to send him away, Martha said finally. But if what he says is true, if you're already in danger because of your kindness, then driving him out won't solve anything. Agnes nodded slowly. Father Aldrich's questions this morning weren't just about the creature. He asked about your healing methods, your grandmother's grimoire, whether you'd ever displayed abilities that might suggest supernatural influence. Elira felt cold, dread settle in her stomach. The moonstone pendant seemed to pulse with warning warmth against her skin. What did you tell him? The truth that you're the most skilled healer we've known, that your remedies work better than anyone else's, that you sometimes seem to know what someone needs before they ask. Beatrice paused, understanding dawning in her eyes. But now I realize how such testimony might sound to someone already suspicious of supernatural corruption. Vaughn stepped forward, his movement causing the women to tense despite his obvious attempt at reassurance. The inquisitors will come whether I remain or depart. Your choice now is whether Elira faces that threat alone or with someone capable of protecting her. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. What had begun as a simple act of mercy had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The women who had come to urge caution now found themselves forced to consider whether their friend's greatest safety might lie with the very creature they had feared. That evening, after the village women had departed with troubled faces and uncertain promises to speak carefully, if questioned further, Elira found herself alone with Vaughn and the growing weight of their impossible situation. The cottage felt smaller somehow, as though the outside world's suspicion was pressing against its walls, seeking entry. "Show me," she said quietly as they sat by the fireplace, the dancing flames casting shadows that seemed to dance around Vaughn's pale features. "Show you what?" he asked, though his silver eyes suggested he understood her meaning. "Your true nature, not the weakened prisoner I purchased at auction, not the grateful guest seeking sanctuary. Show me who you really are, what you're capable of, what I've truly invited into my home." Vaughn studied her face for a long moment, perhaps searching for signs of fear or second thoughts. When he found only steady determination, he nodded slowly and rose from his chair. "Very well. But understand, once you see me as I truly am, There will be no pretending this is merely an act of charity toward a helpless stranger. He moved to the center of the room, and as Elira watched, something fundamental shifted in his bearing. The careful restraint that had marked his every movement since arriving at her cottage fell away like a discarded cloak. Power flowed through his frame, ancient and terrible and beautiful, transforming him from wounded refugee to something that commanded both awe and instinctive terror. His eyes brightened to silver flame, his pale skin seemed to luminescence within a light, and when he smiled, she glimpsed the sharp canines that marked his predatory nature. Yet more than the physical transformation, it was the presence that emerged centuries of authority. Power wielded with absolute confidence, the bearing of one who had ruled kingdoms and commanded armies. I am Van Malthorn, last Lord of the Shadowlands, commander of the Northern Reaches, keeper of the old covenants between the mortal and supernatural worlds. His voice carried new resonance, as though speaking from depths she hadn't known existed. I have walked through the rise and fall of empires, witnessed the birth of legends, and survived the deaths of gods. From his finger, he drew a ring she had not noticed before, ancient gold set with a stone that seemed to hold captured starlight. The signet bore symbols that hurt to look upon directly, markings that spoke of authority over forces beyond mortal understanding. This ring once commanded the allegiance of 7 vampire houses, sealed treaties between the living and the undead, and opened pathways between worlds that mortals can barely imagine. He held it toward the firelight, and the shadows in the room seemed to bow toward its radiance. I offer it now to you, not as master to servant, but as equal to equal, if you choose to stand beside me in what is coming. Elira stared at the ring, understanding instinctively that accepting it would transform her as surely as Van's presence had already begun changing her world. The moonstone pendant grew warm against her skin, resonating with the ancient power Van displayed. What exactly are you asking of me? Partnership? Alliance? The joining of your healing wisdom with my supernatural strength? He moved closer, his transformed presence filling the cottage with energies that made her grandmother's protective charms hum with responsive power. The church. Hunters who come for us possess weapons blessed specifically to destroy my kind, but they also carry tools designed to break human will, to extract confessions through suffering, to eliminate anyone they deem corrupted by supernatural influence. She rose to face him, noting how his revealed power made her own hidden nature respond. The grimoire on her table began to glow softly, its ancient pages awakening to supernatural presence in ways she had never witnessed. You're saying I'm already marked for death. I'm saying you were marked the moment you chose mercy over safety, compassion over conformity. His silver gaze held hers steadily. But I'm also saying you don't have to face that fate alone or powerless. Outside the cottage, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening quiet, multiple riders moving with the purposeful rhythm of military precision. Van's enhanced hearing had detected them long before they became audible to mortal ears. They come sooner than I expected, he said, his power condensing around him like armor, forged from shadows and starlight. Elira moved to her window, peering through the shutters to see torches approaching through the gathering darkness. At least a dozen mounted figures, their armor bearing the symbols of church authority, their weapons gleaming with the blessed metals that could wound supernatural beings and compel truth from reluctant tongues. Inquisitors, she whispered, understanding that her quiet life had ended, as surely as if she had died. Led by Father Aldrich, though he takes orders from higher authority now. Van joined her at the window, his transformed presence making the very air around them thrum with barely contained power. They'll demand my surrender first, offer you clemency in exchange for cooperation. When you refuse, and you will refuse, because I see the steel in your spine, they'll take us both by force. Elira thought of the sacred ash stakes Martha had mentioned. Weapons, designed to pierce vampire hearts and end immortal existence. She thought of the torture chambers beneath monastery walls, where suspected witches confessed to crimes they had never committed, rather than endure another moment of sanctified agony. "The ring," she said, extending her hand. "If I'm going to face this, I'd rather do it with power than as a victim." Varn's smile held both admiration and sorrow. "Once you wear it, there will be no returning to your former life. The power it grants comes with prices that extend far beyond this moment." "My former life ended the moment I bid on your freedom," she replied firmly. "I chose this path with my eyes open. Now I choose to walk it with strength." He slipped the ancient ring onto her finger, and power flooded through her like lightning seeking ground. Her vision sharpened, her hearing expanded, and she felt connections awakening to forces she had never imagined, the network of supernatural energy that ran beneath the mortal world, like hidden rivers beneath familiar landscape. The grimoire burst into full radiance, its pages turning of their own accord to reveal sections her grandmother had warned were too dangerous to read. Now the ancient words made sense, their meanings clear, as though she had always known their secrets. "What am I becoming?" she gasped as the transformation settled into her bones. "What you were always meant to be," Varn replied. "Your bloodline carries the heritage of the old pacts, the ability to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal worlds. The ring simply awakens what was already dormant within you." The riders had reached her garden gate. In moments, they would surround the cottage and present their demands. But as Elira stood beside Varn, power coursing through her transformed nature, she felt ready for whatever came next. She had chosen compassion over safety, and now she would discover where that choice ultimately led. The Inquisitors surrounded the cottage with military precision, their torches casting dancing shadows across Elira's impossible roses. Father Aldrich dismounted first, his familiar face now marked by the cold authority of one who served powers far beyond the simple village parish. Behind him came 6 armed men, bearing the regalia of the Sacred Order of Divine Purification, and at their center rode a figure that made even Varn step back from the window in recognition. "Inquisitor General Matthias Kane," Varn breathed, his voice carrying centuries of old hatred. "I should have known the Church would send their most ruthless hunter." Elira studied the tall, gaunt man, whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the air around him. His armor bore symbols that hurt to look upon directly, and the sword at his side pulsed with energies that made her newly awakened supernatural senses recoil in instinctive fear. "You know him? We have a history spanning 3 centuries, Varn replied grimly. "He was the one who orchestrated my capture, who bound me with those cursed shackles, who intended my execution to be the crown jewel of his campaign against supernatural beings." A thunderous knock shook the cottage door, followed by Father Aldrich's voice raised in formal proclamation. "By the authority of the Sacred Inquisition and the divine will of the Almighty, we command the surrender of the creature known as Varn Malthorn and all who harbor him. You have 1 minute to comply before we enter by force." Varn moved to stand beside Elira, his transformed power radiating protective intensity. "They expect us to cower in terror, to beg for mercy that will never come. Instead, let us show them what they truly face." But as Elira prepared to open the door and confront their enemies, her grandmother's grimoire suddenly erupted with light that filled the entire cottage. The ancient book rose from its table, pages flying open to reveal text that blazed like captured fire across the parchment. Words in a language older than Latin, older than any tongue spoken by living men, burned themselves into Elira's consciousness. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The text spoke of bloodlines and ancient pacts, of families chosen to serve as bridges between worlds, of powers that had slumbered for generations, waiting for the proper catalyst to awaken them. But more than that, it revealed the truth about her purchase of Varn at the auction. "It wasn't chance," she gasped, staggering as understanding flooded through her. "My bidding on you, bringing you here, none of it was coincidence." Varn turned to her, confusion replacing his battle readiness. "What are you saying?" "The grimoire, it's showing me the truth." Her voice shook as she read the blazing text that only her transformed eyes could decipher. "My bloodline, my family's heritage, we weren't just healers. We were guardians, keepers of an ancient covenant between your people and mine." The cottage shook as the Inquisitors began their assault on the door, but Elira barely noticed. The revelation consuming her attention was far more earth-shaking than their immediate physical danger. 3 centuries ago, when your brother betrayed you, when the curse transformed you into what you are now, that wasn't the end of your story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The curse carried a clause, a possibility for redemption that required specific conditions to be met. Vaughn's silver eyes widened as memory stirred. The prophecy. I thought it was merely my brother's cruel jest, a false hope designed to torment me with impossible dreams. What prophecy? That one of pure heart would purchase my freedom with sacrificial love, that such an act would begin the process of breaking the curse that bound me to darkness. His voice carried wonder and growing hope, but the conditions were so specific, so unlikely I dismissed it as meaningless after the first century passed without fulfillment. The door exploded inward as the predend Inquisitors breached their sanctuary, but Elira continued reading from the blazing grimoire, understanding flooding through her consciousness like water through a broken dam. "The blood oath chalice," she breathed, pointing to an artifact that now materialized on her table, ancient silver, inscribed with symbols that matched those on Vaughn's ring. "It's been hidden in my family's collection for generations, waiting for this moment." Inquisitor General Kaine strode through the shattered doorway, his presence filling the cottage with oppressive cold. "The heretic woman reads from forbidden texts," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute judgment. "She has been corrupted beyond salvation." Father Aldrich followed, his face bearing the expression of a man who had discovered his worst fears confirmed. "Elira, you were like a daughter to me. How could you fall so far into darkness?" But Vaughn stepped forward, his power blazing like a shield around both himself and Elira. "She has fallen into nothing but truth, priest. Truth your church has spent centuries trying to suppress. Silence, abomination." Kaine drew his blessed sword, its blade erupting with holy fire designed to burn supernatural flesh. "Your corruption ends tonight, along with all who have aided you." "Wait," Elira commanded, her voice carrying new authority that made even the Inquisitors pause. The grimoire's revelation had shown her not just her heritage, but her power and her choice. She lifted the blood oath chalice from the table, feeling its ancient weight, understanding its purpose. This chalice was crafted to seal or break supernatural bonds. For 3 centuries, Vaughn has been bound by a curse of darkness. But the same power that bound him can free him if one of pure intention offers herself as willing anchor for his redemption. Kaine's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You speak of vampire bonding rituals. Such corruption will damn your soul for eternity. Will it?" Elira met his gaze steadily. "Or will it transform darkness into light, curse into blessing, isolation into partnership? My family has guarded this secret for generations, waiting for the moment when love would prove stronger than fear." The moonstone pendant blazed like a captured star against her throat, resonating with the chalice's power and confirming what she had begun to suspect from the moment she saw Vaughn at the auction. "This was never about purchasing a slave or saving a stranger," she continued, understanding dawning like sunrise after endless night. "This was about recognizing the other half of my soul, separated by curse and time, but destined to find each other when the moment was right." Vaughn stared at her, hope and wonder warring with disbelief in his silver eyes. "Elira, if you're wrong, if the prophecy is false or the ritual fails, we'll both be destroyed. Worse than destroyed, our souls will be bound in eternal torment." "And if I'm right?" she asked, lifting the chalice between them. "If love truly is stronger than curse, if redemption is possible even for those who have dwelt in darkness, then we face whatever comes next together." he replied. His voice, carrying the weight of centuries of loneliness, finally offered hope of ending. Inquisitor Kaine raised his blazing sword. "I will not permit such abomination to— You will witness," Elira commanded, and power flowed from her transformed nature to hold the Inquisitors motionless. Not to harm them, but to prevent them from interfering with what destiny had set in motion. "You will see whether love or fear proves the stronger force, whether mercy or judgment better serves the divine will you claim to represent." She turned to Van, offering him the chalice that would either redeem them both or destroy them utterly. "I choose you," she said simply, "not because I'm foolish or corrupted or blind to consequences. I choose you because my heart recognizes yours, because your darkness calls to my light, because together we can become something neither of us could achieve alone." The cottage blazed with supernatural radiance as ancient powers awakened, waiting to see which force would prove supreme, the curse that bound Van to darkness, or the love that offered to transform them both into something entirely new. The blood oath chalice pulsed with ancient power between Elira's hands, its silver surface reflecting not the torchlight from the Inquisitor's flames, but something deeper, starlight captured from skies that had witnessed the forging of the original covenant between mortal and vampire realms. As she lifted it toward Van, the cottage itself seemed to hold its breath, walls that had sheltered 3 generations of healers, now witnessing a moment that would reshape the boundary between human and supernatural worlds. The ritual requires blood freely given, words of binding spoken with absolute intention, and the willingness to share whatever consequences may follow, Elira said, the knowledge flowing through her consciousness, as though she had always known these ancient requirements. Once begun, it cannot be stopped or reversed. Van's silver eyes searched her face, looking for any trace of doubt or fear. "You understand what you're risking, not just your mortal life, but the very nature of your soul. If the curse proves stronger than love, if redemption is impossible, then we face that together too," she replied firmly, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through decades of healing others' pain. "I've lived 53 years as a mortal woman, Van. I've known love and loss, purpose and loneliness, the full measure of what human existence offers. If I can transform that experience into something that frees you from centuries of suffering, then I consider it a life well spent." Behind them, frozen by the power she had unconsciously wielded, the Inquisitors stood like statues carved from ice and fury. Only. Their eyes moved, tracking every gesture, every word, recording what they would surely report as the ultimate corruption of a once pure soul. Father Aldrich's face bore the expression of a man watching his daughter choose damnation, despite all his prayers and guidance. Yet from the back of the cottage came an unexpected sound, the soft whisper of feet on wooden floors. Old Widow Thornton stepped through the shattered doorway, her weathered face resolute despite the supernatural energies crackling through the air. "Agnes?" Elira gasped, her concentration wavering enough to allow the woman to approach despite the magical barriers holding the Inquisitors motionless. 50 years I've known you, child," Agnes said, her voice carrying the authority of advanced age and witnessed wisdom. 50 years I've watched you heal our sick, comfort our dying, ease our suffering without thought of reward or recognition. If you say this man deserves redemption, if you believe love can transform darkness, then I believe it too." Martha Thornton appeared next, then young Beatrice Cooper clutching her infant son, then Marcus the blacksmith's apprentice with his still bandaged hand. One by one, the villagers who had known Elira longest began filing through the destroyed entrance, surrounding the cottage with their presence, despite the obvious supernatural danger. "You came," Elira whispered, tears blurring her vision as she recognized face after familiar face. "We discussed it after the women brought word of your situation," Martha explained. "Father Aldrich may speak for the church, but you speak for something deeper, for the healing touch that has sustained this community through its darkest hours." Marcus stepped forward, offering a small object wrapped in cloth. "My master sent this," he said, unveiling a pendant crafted from blessed silver and adorned with a phoenix feather, the legendary protection charm thought lost for generations, now revealed to have been safeguarded by the village smithy. "Willem's family has been keepers of the old knowledge for longer than most. Remember," Agnes explained as Marcus fastened the pendant around Elira's neck. "The phoenix feather will shield against holy weapons and supernatural attacks alike, but more than that, it represents rebirth, the transformation of ending into beginning." The phoenix feather amulet blazed to life against Elira's chest, its radiance joining with her moonstone pendant to create a harmony of protective energies that made even Inquisitor General Kaine's blessed sword dim by comparison. Around her neck, she now wore the accumulated protection of generations moonstone for supernatural sight, phoenix feather for transformation and rebirth, all charged with the collective intention of a community choosing love over fear. "The entire village knows what you're attempting," Beatrice said softly, her infant son reaching tiny fingers toward the blazing chalice without fear. Old Henrik the Chronicler found records in the church archives, stories of the original covenant your grandmother's line was sworn to protect. "We understand now why you were called to save this man." Varn stared at the assembled villagers in wonder. "You risk everything by standing here. The Inquisitors will mark you all as corrupted by association." "Let them," Willem the blacksmith declared, stepping through the crowd to stand before Varn. "I've worked iron for 40 years, and I recognize the difference between metal that's been blessed to heal and metal that's been cursed to harm. Those chains they bound you with, they reeked of hatred and fear. But the tools my family forged to protect this village's guardian, they sing with hope." The cottage blazed brighter as more protective artifacts emerged from hidden places, charms and amulets, blessed stones and carved talismans, the accumulated spiritual defenses of a community that had always known more about the supernatural world than outsiders suspected. Each object added its energy to the growing vortex of power surrounding Elira and Varn, creating a sanctuary blessed not by church authority, but by the genuine faith of people who had experienced true healing. "The ritual must begin," Varn said, his voice tight with emotion as he witnessed the impossible, an entire community choosing to stand with them against the forces of institutional fear and hatred. "The Inquisitors won't remain frozen much longer, and when they break free, they'll face all of us," Agnes said firmly. "You think a handful of church soldiers frightens people who've survived famine, plague, and the loss of everything they held dear. We've learned that love is the only force worth fighting for." Elira lifted the blood oath chalice higher, feeling its ancient power responding to the collective will of the villagers surrounding them. The grimoire's pages continued turning of their own accord, revealing the words she would need to speak, the precise ritual that could break a curse forged in betrayal and hatred. "I, Elira of the healing bloodline, keeper of ancient covenants, guardian of the bridge between mortal and immortal realms," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite the supernatural energies crackling through the air. "I offer my blood freely given, my soul willingly shared, my destiny forever joined to yours. Varn Malthorn, last lord of the Shadowlands." She pricked her finger on the chalice's silver edge, letting 3 drops of blood fall into its depths. The ancient vessel blazed like captured sunlight, its radiance driving back the shadows that had clung to Varn's form for 3 centuries. "I accept your offering, Elira of compassionate heart," Varn replied, taking the chalice with hands that trembled despite his supernatural strength. "I pledge my protection freely given, my power willingly shared, my eternity forever joined to yours, guardian of healing wisdom," he added, but his own blood to the mixture, and the chalice's radiance exploded outward in waves that washed over every person present. But instead of the burning agony the Inquisitors expected supernatural power to bring, the villagers felt only warmth, the same gentle, healing energy they had experienced countless times under Elira's care, but now magnified and transformed into something that spoke of redemption rather than corruption. The phoenix feather pendant blazed in harmony with the chalice's power, creating a protective dome around the cottage that made the Inquisitor's blessed weapons appear dim and ineffective. Through the walls, through the very foundations of her family home, Elira felt the awakening of forces that had slumbered since the first covenant was forged between her ancestor and Van's original vampiric house. "Together," she whispered, lifting the chalice to her lips. "Together," Van agreed, his silver eyes blazing with hope and love and the promise of transformation. But, as they prepared to drink from the blood oath chalice that would either redeem them both or destroy them utterly, Inquisitor General Kaine's frozen form began to crack with supernatural effort. His blessed armor sparked with divine energies as he fought against the bonds holding him motionless, his hatred providing strength to break through even the most powerful protective magic. The final moment had arrived, the choice between love and fear, redemption and destruction, would be decided in the next few heartbeats as the forces of divine authority and ancient covenant prepared for their ultimate confrontation. The chalice touched Elira's lips just as Inquisitor General Kaine shattered the magical bonds, holding him motionless. His blessed sword erupted with holy fire as he lunged forward, the sanctified silver sword designed to pierce vampire hearts and cleave supernatural bonds before they could be completed. "I will not permit this abomination," he roared, his blade cutting through the air with lethal precision. But the assembled villagers moved as one, their combined will creating a barrier of pure intention that turned even blessed steel aside. The sword struck an invisible wall just inches from Elira's throat, sparks of divine and mortal energy crackling where opposing forces met and matched each other's strength. "You face not one corrupted soul, Inquisitor," Agnes declared, her weathered hands glowing with the same protective light that surrounded the cottage, but an entire community that has chosen love over fear. Kaine's gaunt face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You are all corrupted. This entire village has been infected by supernatural influence." "No," Willem replied firmly, his blacksmith's hands steady despite the supernatural energies swirling around them. "We have been healed by it. For decades, Elira has shown us what true divine power looks like, not the kind that burns and destroys, but the kind that mends what is broken." The chalice blazed between Elira's hands as she drank from its ancient depths, the mingled blood carrying power that transformed her very essence. She felt Van's centuries of loneliness merging with her decades of compassionate service, creating something neither purely mortal nor traditionally vampire, but entirely new. Van followed, drinking deeply from the sacred vessel, and as the ritual took hold, the curse that had bound him to darkness began to crack like ice exposed to sudden warmth. The shadows that had clung to his form for 3 centuries started to dissolve, replaced by a radiance that spoke of redemption earned through suffering and love freely given. Father Aldrich broke free from his own supernatural paralysis, his face a mask of anguish and betrayal. "Elira, you were like a daughter to me. How can you choose damnation over salvation? How can you call this damnation?" She replied, her voice carrying new harmonics as the transformation settled into her bones. "Look around you, Father. See the light that fills this place. Feel the healing energy that radiates from every stone, every timber, every blessed artifact our community has brought to protect this moment." The cottage itself seemed to pulse with renewed life, its walls glowing with warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace and everything to do with the love and faith of those gathered within. The impossible roses in her garden blazed like captured stars, their supernatural beauty now joined by other miraculous blooms sprouting from every crack in the foundation. every beam in the ceiling. "This is not the corruption you were taught to fear," Varn said, his own voice transformed as the curse released its hold on his soul. "This is the fulfillment of the covenant your own church helped establish centuries ago, before fear replaced faith in their teachings." Cain raised his sword again, its blessed fire burning brighter, as he drew upon reserves of divine power granted to the most faithful servants of church authority. "I have hunted your kind for 3 centuries. I have seen the destruction you bring, the innocent lives you steal, the corruption you spread wherever you dwell. And yet," Elira stepped forward, fearless now in her transformed state, "in all those centuries of hunting, have you ever witnessed what you see here tonight? Have you ever seen supernatural power used to heal rather than harm, to create beauty rather than destroy it, to bring communities together rather than tear them apart?" The sanctified silver sword trembled in Kaine's grip as doubt crept into his certainty. Around the cottage, the evidence of transformation was undeniable, flowers blooming where none should grow, villagers standing unafraid in the presence of beings they had been taught to fear, light radiating from sources that defied every doctrine he had been taught to defend. "Lies," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Seductive lies, designed to corrupt the faithful." "Truth," Agnes corrected gently, stepping between the Inquisitor and his intended targets. "Truth that your church fears because it reveals the limitations of their understanding." The other Inquisitors began breaking free from their magical restraints, drawing their own blessed weapons and moving to surround the cottage. But as they raised their sanctified tools of destruction, the villagers responded not with fear, but with an outpouring of protective energy that made every weapon dim and falter. Young Beatrice lifted her infant son toward the blazing chalice, and the child laughed with pure delight at the radiance it cast, reaching tiny fingers toward the light without fear. "My baby sees no monsters here," she said softly. "Only love made manifest in forms we haven't learned to recognize." Marcus stepped forward, his bandaged hand glowing with the same healing light that had always emanated from Elira's touch. "She healed me yesterday as a mortal woman, and she heals through our community tonight as something greater. How can the source of such blessing be called cursed?" The cottage filled with power as the blood oath ritual reached its crescendo, ancient covenants awakening to transform not just Elira and Varn, but the very nature of the relationship between mortal and supernatural realms. The blood oath ritual reached its completion as Elira and Varn's combined essence created something unprecedented, a vessel containing the pure distillation of love, triumphant over curse, hope victorious over despair. The heart's blood vial materialized between their joined hands, glowing with radiance that spoke of bonds unbreakable by mortal or divine intervention. "Impossible," Kaine breathed, staggering backward as the cottage erupted with light that challenged every doctrine he had spent centuries defending. "No vampire can be redeemed. No corruption can be purified. It is written in the sacred texts." "Then perhaps your texts are incomplete," Varn replied, his transformed nature radiating power that protected rather than threatened, healed rather than harmed. "Perhaps they were written by those who feared what they could not understand, rather than by those who sought wisdom in love's mysteries." The heart's blood vial pulsed with energy that transformed everyone it touched. The villagers found their own latent supernatural abilities, awakening healing gifts that had always run in their bloodlines, but had been suppressed by generations of church teachings that labeled such talents as corrupted. Agnes's weathered hands began to glow with the same therapeutic light Elira had always carried. Willem's iron-working tools hummed with power to forge protective charms. Even young Marcus discovered he could sense supernatural presences with clarity that would have made him valuable to either church hunters or supernatural communities seeking protection. "You see," Elira said, addressing the Inquisitors, whose blessed weapons now seemed dim and ineffective against the radiance surrounding the cottage. "This is not corruption spreading through our community. This is awakening the revelation of gifts that have always existed but were hidden by fear and misunderstanding. Father Aldrich's face crumpled with the weight of realizations that challenged everything he had believed about divine will and supernatural evil. If this is possible, if redemption can transform even vampires, then what does that mean for the Church's teachings? What does it mean for the hundreds of innocent people we have executed as corrupted? It means, Varn said gently, his voice carrying the wisdom of centuries spent in exile and suffering, that divine love is larger than human understanding, that grace extends beyond the boundaries mortals try to impose upon it. Cain raised his sanctified sword one final time, drawing upon every reserve of blessed power his centuries of service had granted him. The weapon blazed like captured sunlight, its edge sharp enough to cleave supernatural bonds, and its fire hot enough to burn immortal flesh. "I will not permit this heresy to spread," he declared, lunging forward with the desperate fury of a man whose entire worldview was collapsing around him. But the heart's blood vial responded to the threat by expanding its protective aura, and Cain's blessed blade met not Elira and Varn's vulnerable flesh, but a barrier of pure love made manifest. The sanctified weapon shattered against the force of their unbreakable bond, its fragments dissolving into harmless light that scattered like morning dew across the cottage floor. "Your weapons cannot harm what has been perfected by willing sacrifice," Elira explained, as Cain stared at the ruins of his most powerful tool. "We chose this transformation together, with full understanding of its costs and complete acceptance of its consequences." The other inquisitors dropped their own weapons as they witnessed their leader's defeat, their blessed armor dimming as they realized they faced not the supernatural corruption they had been trained to destroy, but something entirely beyond their experience or understanding. "What are you?" one of them whispered, fear and wonder warring in his voice. "We are what love creates when it refuses to accept that anything is beyond redemption," Varn answered. "What hope builds when it dares to believe that curses can become blessings, that isolation can transform into connection, that even the darkest nights must eventually yield to dawn?" The cottage blazed with triumphant radiance as the transformation reached its culmination. Elira felt her mortal limitations dissolving, replaced by abilities that would allow her to heal not just physical wounds, but spiritual suffering, to bridge the gap between human and supernatural communities that had been separated by centuries of mutual fear and misunderstanding. Varn's ancient curse shattered completely, freeing him from the darkness that had bound him while allowing him to retain the wisdom and strength gained through centuries of suffering. Together, they had become something neither purely mortal nor traditionally vampire, but entirely new proof that love could indeed triumph over the most impossible circumstances. Around them, the villagers stood witness to the miracle of redemption made manifest, their own awakened gifts allowing them to sense the profound rightness of what they had just experienced. The cottage that had sheltered 3 generations of healers now blazed like a beacon of hope, calling to others who had been lost in darkness and promising them that sanctuary and transformation were possible. The heart's blood vial settled into Elira's palm, its radiance gradually softening to a warm glow that spoke of power held in trust rather than wielded in conquest. The blood oath was complete, the ancient covenant renewed, and the bridge between mortal and immortal realms strengthened by the willing sacrifice of 2 souls who had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, union over separation. The battle was won, but the greater victory, the transformation of hearts and minds, the healing of ancient wounds between communities, was just beginning. 3 months after the night that transformed Grimhaven forever, Elira stood in her garden, watching the impossible roses bloom alongside herbs that now grew with supernatural vitality. The cottage had become something unprecedented, a sanctuary where mortal and immortal beings could find healing, understanding, and acceptance. The transformation had rippled outward through the village and beyond, creating changes that no one could have anticipated. Varn emerged from the cottage carrying the eternal promise ring they had crafted together during their first month as bonded partners. Forged from silver, blessed by their community and essence drawn from their merged supernatural nature, it represented not ownership or possession, but the freely given commitment of two souls who had found their perfect complement in each other. "The delegation from the eastern provinces has arrived," he told her, slipping the ring onto her finger in the daily ritual that had replaced traditional wedding vows. 3 vampire houses, a coven of healing witches, and representatives from the shapeshifter clans. They all seek to understand what we've created here. Elira smiled, watching through her transformed vision as the various supernatural beings made camp in the meadow beyond her garden. Word had spread through the hidden networks that connected all who lived outside normal human society. A vampire had been redeemed through love. A mortal had transcended her limitations through willing sacrifice, and together they had created a bridge between worlds that had been separated for centuries. And the Church's response? Father Aldrich received word yesterday. The Sacred Council has agreed to send a theological commission to investigate what they're calling the Grimhaven phenomenon. Apparently, our example has inspired similar transformations in other communities, and the Church can no longer simply dismiss such events as isolated corruptions. In the months since their bonding, the cottage had welcomed visitors from across the spectrum of supernatural society. Vampires seeking redemption for past sins, mortals discovering latent magical abilities, healing practitioners from traditions the Church had long suppressed. All came seeking guidance from the unlikely pair, who had proven that ancient barriers could be dissolved through understanding and acceptance. Agnes approached through the garden, her own transformation evident in the way herbs responded to her touch with renewed vitality. At 73, the widow had discovered healing gifts that surpassed anything her younger years had suggested possible. "The morning's patients have been tended," she reported, though patients no longer adequately described those who sought Elira's help. The cottage now served visitors, ranging from wounded vampires, fleeing church hunters, to human families whose children showed signs of supernatural heritage. "Thank you, Agnes. Your assistance has been invaluable." The older woman smiled, her weathered face radiating the contentment that came from discovering purpose beyond her previous imagining. Who would have thought that purchasing a vampire at auction would lead to the most meaningful work of my life? Young Marcus rounded the corner of the cottage. His former position as blacksmith's apprentice evolved into something closer to guardian and ambassador. His awakened ability to sense supernatural presences made him invaluable for screening visitors and ensuring that those seeking the cottage's sanctuary came with genuine rather than hostile intentions. "Mistress Elira, there's a family approaching from the south, a woman with 3 children, traveling alone. The youngest shows signs of vampire heritage, probably a half-blood whose human parent doesn't understand what's happening to the child." Such arrivals had become common as word spread through desperate communities. Families torn apart by the discovery of supernatural heritage, individuals fleeing persecution for abilities they couldn't control, beings from various species seeking neutral ground where their differences might be bridged rather than weaponized. "Prepare the guest quarters," Elira instructed, "and ask Willem to bring one of his calming charms. A frightened child with developing vampire abilities will need all the comfort we can provide." As the afternoon progressed, the cottage filled with its usual mixture of visitors, residents, and pilgrims. The front rooms served as healing chambers, where Elira tended to injuries both physical and spiritual. The kitchen had been expanded to accommodate the dietary needs of various supernatural species. The garden provided herbs and ingredients for remedies that worked equally well on mortal and immortal constitutions. But it was the evening gathering in the main room that best represented what their transformation had achieved. Around the enlarged fireplace, representatives from species that had been enemies for millennia shared stories, compared experiences, and slowly built the foundations of understanding that might eventually grow into lasting peace. Varn settled beside Elira on the bench they had crafted together, his presence still sending warmth through her transformed nature. The eternal promise ring caught firelight, its surface reflecting not just flame, but the faces of all those who had found sanctuary within their walls. "Do you ever regret your choice?" he asked quietly, the question that had haunted their early days together. "Only that it took me 53 years to make it," she replied, leaning against his shoulder and marveling again at how perfectly they fit together. "I spent decades thinking I understood what healing meant. Mending broken bones, easing physical pain, treating symptoms that I could see and touch. I never imagined that the greatest healing might require transforming the very nature of what it means to be human." Through the cottage windows, they could see the lights of Grimhaven twinkling in the distance. The village had changed as well, becoming a haven for those who existed on the margins of normal society. Father Aldrich, after weeks of theological struggle, had begun incorporating teachings about supernatural redemption into his sermons. The blacksmith's forge now produced protective charms alongside horseshoes and farming tools. Even the inn had adapted to serve travelers whose dietary needs extended beyond ordinary human requirements. "Tomorrow brings new challenges," Varn observed, watching as one of the visiting vampire lords engaged in animated discussion with a representative from the witch covens. "The old barriers are crumbling, but building new bridges requires patience and wisdom we're still learning to possess. Then it's fortunate we have eternity to perfect the work," Elira replied, touching the eternal promise ring that symbolized not just their personal bond, but their commitment to the larger transformation they had initiated. Outside, the impossible roses bloomed under starlight, their supernatural beauty a testament to the power of love to create wonders where none had existed before. The cottage that had sheltered one lonely healer now stood as proof that compassion could indeed triumph over fear, that understanding could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the greatest magic was simply the willingness to see beyond what others insisted was possible.